The Millionaire CEO stopped for coffee, and saw three little girls sharing one muffin with birthday hats on their heads. He didn't know why, but something in his chest cracked open. Jason Carter never intended to stop at that cafe. His mornings were usually defined by perfectly timed routines, chauffeur drives, and coffee prepared by his assistant exactly the way he liked it, strong, hot, with a splash of almond milk. But that morning, something broke the pattern. His driver was stuck in traffic, his assistant was late responding, and Jason found himself walking a few city blocks on foot, something he hadn't done in years. The cafe was modest, nothing special, tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. It wasn't the kind of place he'd normally choose, but he needed caffeine and it was open. He stepped inside, already mentally sorting through a list of emails and meetings, barely registering the warm scent of cinnamon and coffee beans that greeted him. As he waited in line, tapping his phone impatiently, a burst of giggles pulled his attention away. At a table in the corner, three little girls sat wearing colorful paper birthday hats. They were identical, clearly triplets, with dark brown hair tied back into matching ponytails and bright blue eyes that seemed to light up even the quiet corners of the cafe. On their tables sat a single blueberry muffin, cut neatly into 3 equal parts. A half-empty bottle of water stood beside it, and one of the girls carefully placed a plastic straw into a cup with great ceremony. Jason blinked. There was something oddly magnetic about them, something that pulled his attention even when his mind tried to refocus. Then he heard the waitress's voice, gentle but apologetic. "I'm sorry, girls, but unless you have a few more dollars, I can't bring out the cake. Maybe next time, okay?" The girls smiled up at her, not arguing, not upset. One of them leaned forward and said, almost cheerfully, "That's okay. We'll blow out invisible candles. We're really good at pretending." Jason's heart gave a strange twist, like someone had taken a fist to his chest and squeezed. He didn't usually get involved in strangers' lives. He was known for his discipline, his cold logic, and his refusal to entertain emotional distractions. But his feet were already moving before he could think it through. He approached their table, and all three girls turned toward him with identical curious expressions. "Excuse me," he said, his voice softer than he intended, "is it your birthday today?" One of the girls nodded enthusiastically. "It's all our birthday. We're 7. We're triplets." Another added proudly, "We're best friends too." The third just smiled, eyes wide, clearly waiting to see what would happen next. Jason smiled, unsure why his throat felt tight. "Would it be alright if I bought you a real cake?" he asked. The girls looked at one another, then at him. One whispered, "Are you someone famous?" He chuckled, caught off guard. "Not really. Just someone who was late for something important." He turned to the waitress, who had been standing nearby in silence. "Bring them whatever cake you have. The biggest one." She nodded, eyes wide. As the girls clapped and began excitedly rearranging napkins for their real celebration, Jason sat down at the table, completely forgetting his schedule, his coffee, and the emails buzzing in his pocket. Something about them, their joy in the face of so little, their quiet resilience, hit something in him he hadn't felt in years. And as he listened to them talk about school, their mom, and the songs they'd practiced for their birthday, he had no idea that this small act of kindness was about to open a door to a past he never knew existed. The cake arrived 15 minutes later, towering with layers of chocolate and whipped cream, adorned with rainbow sprinkles and exactly 7 candles, as if the universe had known the number all along. The girls gasped in unison, their hands covering their mouths, eyes wide with delight and disbelief. Jason watched them closely, taking in every movement, the way one of them reached out timidly to touch the cake as if it might disappear, the way another bounced slightly in her seat trying to contain the excitement that practically shimmered off her skin. The third girl, quieter than the rest, turned to Jason with a look so genuine it made him forget everything else. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice almost trembling. "This is the best birthday ever." The waitress brought over a lighter, and Jason let each girl take turns lighting their own candle, holding his breath as their little hands steadied the flame. When they all finished, they sat together, eyes closed, whispering wishes into the warm space between them. Then, in a chorus, they blew out the candles together, their laughter erupting seconds later, like music that filled every quiet shadow of the cafe. People at nearby tables smiled, some clapped, and the moment, small and unexpected, became something unforgettable. Jason found himself leaning in, asking questions he didn't usually ask. What were their names? Where did they go to school? What kind of cake did they usually like? Their answers came quickly, layered with the openness only children could offer. "I'm Sophie," said the boldest of the three. "I'm Haley," said the one who had lit the last candle. "And I'm Emma," said the quietest, still holding a fork like it was the most precious thing she owned. They told him about their school, how Haley loved science but hated spelling, how Sophie was the fastest runner in her grade, and how Emma once got a gold star for a picture she drew of her mom holding the moon. As they spoke, Jason noticed how often they mentioned their mother, how she worked at night and slept during the day, how she always made pancakes from scratch when she wasn't too tired, how she sewed their Halloween costumes even when she came home exhausted. There was no bitterness in their voices, only admiration. They didn't speak of a father. Not once. And Jason didn't ask. The cake was nearly gone when he realized he had completely lost track of time. His phone, which he had silenced earlier, buzzed repeatedly in his pocket with calls and messages. But he didn't reach for it. Instead, he asked, "Would you like a ride home?" The girls looked at each other, and Sophie, ever the bold one, nodded. "We live really close. But Mommy said not to walk with strangers." Jason respected that. "Then maybe I could walk with you. Just to make sure you get there safe. You can call me Mr. Jason." They giggled at the formality, but agreed. The walk was short. They chatted the whole way, about their favorite cartoons, about a stray cat that sometimes waited by their door, about the birthday card they had drawn for their mom but hadn't given her yet because they couldn't find an envelope. Jason couldn't remember the last time he had listened so closely, or felt this kind of warmth settle in his chest. When they reached the apartment building, it was clear that it had seen better days. The paint was peeling in spots, and one of the hallway lights was flickering. The girls didn't seem to notice. They bounded up the stairs, and Jason followed more slowly, unsure what he was going to say when their mother opened the door. Part of him thought maybe he'd thank her for raising such incredible daughters. Another part wasn't sure if she'd even want to see him. But when the door swung open, everything inside him stopped. The woman who stood in the doorway wore faded scrubs, her hair pulled back into a tired bun. Her eyes, though framed with exhaustion, were unmistakably the same vibrant blue as the girls'. And Jason knew her. Not from a photograph. Not from coincidence. He had known her years ago. Before his career exploded. Before the boardrooms and the private jets. Before everything. "Amber," he said, his voice hoarse. She blinked in disbelief. The girls stood between them, looking back and forth with wide eyes. "Jason," she breathed, stepping forward, her hand against the doorframe as if to steady herself. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The silence between them buzzed louder than any of the city noise drifting in through the hallway. Emma tugged at Amber's sleeve and whispered, "He bought us cake." Amber's eyes softened. She looked at Jason again, longer this time, and the weight of everything they hadn't said hung heavy in the air. It was clear that nothing about this meeting had been planned, yet it felt like it had been waiting to happen for years. Jason finally stepped back, his mind racing but his voice steady. "They're incredible," he said. "Just like their mother." Amber didn't smile. But she didn't close the door either. Instead, she stepped aside and said, "You'd better come in." The apartment was small but warm, filled with the kind of clutter that only comes from a home with growing children. There were hand-drawn pictures taped to the refrigerator, a stack of books on the coffee table, and toys half-tucked under the worn-out couch. Jason stepped inside slowly, his gaze scanning the space as though trying to absorb the 7 years he had missed all at once. The girls ran ahead, tossing their jackets onto a chair and bouncing around the room as if this reunion between two adults wasn't changing the course of their lives. Amber closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a second longer than necessary. She hadn't expected to see him ever again, and now he was standing in her living room like no time had passed. Except it had. Every minute of those years had been long and heavy. Jason remained near the entrance, unsure if he should sit or speak or leave. He wasn't used to feeling out of place, but in that moment, every carefully built layer of his executive persona felt irrelevant. Amber walked past him and into the small kitchen, where she began making tea without asking if he wanted any. He took that as a sign he was allowed to stay, at least for a few minutes. The girls settled on the couch with a coloring book, whispering excitedly to each other while glancing over at him. He watched them, still stunned by how much they looked like her, and, as he realized now, like him. Amber finally returned with 2 mugs and handed him one without a word. She sat across from him in an old armchair, legs tucked underneath her. Her scrubs looked a size too big, her hair had loose strands falling into her face, and there were dark circles beneath her eyes. But she was still the same woman he had once fallen for. Not glamorous. Not flashy. But strong in a quiet, steady way that had drawn him in before and now pulled at something he hadn't let himself feel in years. He took a sip of the tea before speaking. "I didn't know," he said simply. Amber looked down at her hands. "I know." There was a pause between them, filled with all the things neither knew how to say. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jason asked finally, his voice calm but aching. She didn't look up. "I was going to," she said. "But then. I didn't. I got scared. You had just started your new company, everything was moving fast for you. And I didn't want to be the one to complicate your life." He blinked, struggling to understand. "Amber, they're my children. You had every right to tell me." "I know," she said again, her voice lower now. "But I kept waiting for the right time. Then it got too late. Then I didn't know how anymore." Jason rubbed his hand over his jaw, trying to process it. He looked over at the girls again, still lost in their coloring. "They're amazing," he whispered. Amber smiled faintly. "They are. I'm lucky. They've been my whole world." Her eyes met his. "And I know I made the wrong choice keeping them from you. But I did the best I could." He didn't respond right away. He was still fighting the whirlwind inside him, grief for lost time, anger at being left out, confusion about what to do now. But none of it changed the way his heart had shifted the moment he saw those girls. They were his. That truth had landed with quiet finality, and now it was a part of him. "I want to be in their lives," he said finally. "If you'll let me." Amber didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched him for a long moment. "That's not a decision I can make alone," she said. "You'll have to earn their trust. They've never had a father figure. I've worked hard to protect their hearts." Jason nodded. "Then I'll earn it. However long it takes." She looked down at her tea, then back at him. "You've got a long road ahead, Jason. This isn't a weekend visit situation. They'll have questions. And you'll have to be patient." He met her eyes. "I will be. I promise." The girls looked up just then, as if they knew their names were being spoken in silence. "Can he come again tomorrow?" Sophie asked. Jason and Amber both turned to her. Amber hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If he wants to." Jason smiled, his voice firm. "I do." And just like that, something fragile but real began to form in the room between them, not forgiveness, not yet. But the beginning of something honest, and maybe even something whole. Jason returned the next day, just as he had promised, holding a small paper bag with fresh muffins and a quiet determination that felt heavier than anything he had carried in years. He arrived early, unsure if Amber would even answer the door again, but when it opened and Emma peeked out with a cautious smile, he knew something had shifted. She let him in without calling her sisters, and for a moment, it was just the two of them standing in the small hallway. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with the kind of curiosity only children can hold on to, and asked if he remembered which of the 3 muffins was blueberry, because that one was hers. Jason smiled and told her he hadn't forgotten. The morning passed in quiet, uncertain patterns. The girls took turns showing him their drawings, then dragged him into a lopsided tea party with stuffed animals and plastic cups. At first, he sat stiffly on the floor, unsure how to navigate this world he had missed entirely, but slowly, their laughter softened his edges. Haley made him wear a crown made of construction paper, and when it slipped over his eyes, they all erupted in giggles that echoed through the walls. Amber watched from the kitchen, silently stirring oatmeal, letting herself observe the impossible reality of Jason Carter sitting on her living room floor, being called Sir Muffin King by 3 little girls who had no idea how much he had once meant to her. After breakfast, Amber handed him a backpack and asked if he wanted to walk the girls to school. It was a test, one she hadn't warned him about, but he passed without hesitation. They walked together, Jason holding Haley's hand while Sophie skipped ahead and Emma pointed out cracks in the sidewalk that looked like hearts. When they reached the school gate, Jason crouched down to say goodbye. Haley hugged him without being asked. Sophie gave him a quick high five. But Emma hesitated. Then she reached out, her fingers brushing against his jacket, and whispered, "You came back." He looked her in the eyes and said, "I always will." When he returned to the apartment, Amber was already dressed for work, gathering her things in the narrow hallway. She didn't speak as she zipped her bag, and Jason stood silently until she finally turned to face him. "They like you," she said. "But this isn't going to be simple, Jason. You're a stranger to them, no matter what the truth is." He nodded. "I know. But I want to be more. I want to be their dad." Amber leaned against the doorframe, tiredness pulling at her features. "You can't just step in and fix everything. They don't need fixing. They need stability. And you left without knowing." Her voice wasn't angry, just tired, like someone who had fought too long without relief. Jason swallowed the lump in his throat. "I didn't leave. I didn't even know there was something to stay for." That quieted her. He offered to take the girls every afternoon after school until her night shifts changed. She hesitated, then finally nodded. "If you want to help," she said, "start with the routines. Pick them up. Help with homework. Bedtime stories if they let you. Just be there, every day. Not just when it's convenient." Jason promised he would, not because he had to, but because he couldn't imagine choosing anything else anymore. That week became the first real test. He learned how Sophie hated broccoli and how Emma got nervous in loud rooms. He learned that Haley loved numbers and was afraid of dogs, even small ones. He helped with math worksheets he didn't fully understand and cut out shapes for art projects with fingers clumsy from years of doing nothing domestic. The girls asked questions, some simple, some surprising. "What do you do for work? Do you have pets? Why don't we have the same last name?" And every time, he answered honestly. He didn't know how to be a father yet, but he knew how to tell the truth, and he knew how to show up. So he did, every day. Amber watched from a distance. She didn't interfere, but every time she saw him tying a shoelace or helping with a spilled drink or gently brushing a tangle from Sophie's hair, something inside her softened. She remembered the version of Jason she had once loved, before the money, before the pressure, before life made him someone too big to reach. Now, somehow, this man in her living room was becoming someone real again. One evening, as he helped the girls into their pajamas and tucked Emma into bed, she clung to his sleeve and asked, "Are you going to stay when we're asleep?" Jason looked at her with something breaking in his chest and replied, I'll always stay until you don't need me to anymore." She nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes. Amber, standing quietly in the hallway, heard it too. And for the first time in a long while, she believed him. By the 5th week, the routine no longer felt borrowed. It had become something deeper, something that belonged to all of them now. Jason no longer needed directions to the school, nor reminders about whose backpack had the green zipper and whose needed to be double-checked for the lunchbox. The girls stopped calling him Mr. Jason and began saying just Jason, sometimes even slipping into Dad when they were sleepy or distracted, though none of them mentioned it when it happened. He didn't point it out either. He held those moments like fragile treasures, too sacred to break by acknowledging them. Each afternoon, he picked them up from school, their hands instantly reaching for his as they ran down the sidewalk with stories tumbling out of their mouths like an avalanche. He listened to all of it, the arguments over crayons, the spelling tests, the playground drama, and remembered a version of himself that once lived only for quarterly earnings reports and acquisition deals. This was messier, slower, more unpredictable. But it made sense in a way nothing else ever had. After school, they would stop for a snack, usually something simple like pretzels or apples, which Jason had learned to slice the right way, and then walk home where homework, dancing, and storytelling blurred together in a rhythm that only children could invent. Amber's shifts remained exhausting, but she had started coming home earlier when she could, entering the apartment to the smell of dinner and the sound of laughter. Sometimes she joined them, sometimes she watched from the doorway, too overwhelmed by the sight of what her life had become to speak. She had built everything with her bare hands and exhausted heart for 7 years, and now, without asking, someone was offering to hold part of that weight. One Thursday night, after the girls had gone to bed, Amber found Jason on the couch reading through a children's book he didn't fully understand. He was trying to memorize the characters' names so he wouldn't get them mixed up again. She sat down beside him and said, "You're really trying." He nodded, not looking up. "They deserve it. You do too." She studied him for a moment, then asked the question she'd been holding for days. "Why are you really here, Jason? Is it guilt? Is it obligation?" He closed the book, finally looking at her. It started with shock. Then guilt. But now, it's just love. "I love them. And I missed you." The word surprised both of them in their honesty. Amber looked away, caught between emotion and fear. "This isn't something you can walk away from, Jason. They'll break if you do." "I will too." "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. "Not now. Not ever again." The next day, Jason received an unexpected call at work. It was the school. Emma had gotten into a fight with another student. She had pushed a boy who made fun of her during reading time. Jason dropped everything and arrived at the school faster than he thought possible. When he got to the principal's office, Emma was sitting in a chair too big for her, swinging her legs and holding back tears. Jason crouched down in front of her and asked what happened. She looked up at him and whispered, "He said I didn't have a dad. I told him I do." And then he laughed. Jason felt something burn behind his eyes. He took her hand and looked at the principal, who had already softened. She stood up for herself. "We'll talk at home, but, thank you for calling me." On the way home, Jason didn't scold her. He told her how proud he was that she spoke up. He explained why pushing wasn't the right way, but also that being brave sometimes means telling the truth even when no one believes you. That night, Amber watched them from the kitchen, Emma curled against Jason's side, holding a blanket and listening to him read the story she had picked out herself. It wasn't lost on her how fast things had changed. Or how natural it all looked. When Emma fell asleep, Jason gently lifted her and carried her to her room. Amber followed him down the hall, pausing as he tucked the blanket beneath her chin and kissed her forehead. When they stepped out of the room, Amber didn't speak. She simply took Jason's hand and led him back to the living room. They sat together in silence, no longer needing explanations. The unspoken was enough. What had started as a chance encounter with 3 little girls and a birthday muffin had slowly unraveled every wall she had built. And despite everything, she wasn't scared of the unraveling anymore. She was starting to hope. Jason had always believed in structure. His world was built on precision, meetings scheduled down to the minute, outcomes measured in margins, every move calculated like a game of chess. But life with 3 7-year-old girls had taught him that chaos could be a kind of rhythm too, and that love didn't care much for structure. By the 6th week, he wasn't just visiting their lives. He was woven into them. The girls began drawing pictures with 4 people instead of 3, and every time he saw his likeness sketched in crayon, with 2 big ears or stick arms holding a coffee cup, something inside him softened. His name was no longer an afterthought. It was at the center of their stories now. He had started keeping a drawer in Amber's kitchen filled with snacks he learned the girls liked, organized not by brand but by preference. He knew Haley hated pretzels unless they were shaped like animals, that Emma loved apples but only if he peeled them, and that Sophie insisted every sandwich be cut diagonally, not straight down the middle. He didn't forget. He never missed a detail. And the girls noticed. Trust was no longer something he was reaching for, it was slowly being handed to him, piece by fragile piece. Amber, too, had shifted. She no longer kept her guard raised like armor. She let herself breathe when he was around, sometimes even laughing at his clumsy attempts to fix the leaky faucet or his inability to braid hair correctly. One night, after all 3 girls fell asleep during a movie on the couch, Jason quietly carried them one by one to their beds. Amber followed him down the hallway and paused at Emma's door. When he gently pulled the blanket over her, Amber reached out and touched his arm. It was subtle, brief, but real. Their eyes met in the soft light of the hallway. She whispered, "You're good with them." He smiled and replied, "They make it easy." But beneath the surface of their slowly rebuilding world, something heavier was stirring. Amber had been having migraines for weeks, brushing them off as fatigue, blaming long shifts and missed meals. Jason noticed, of course, but every time he brought it up, she smiled through it, insisting it was nothing. Until one afternoon when she nearly collapsed in the kitchen while stirring soup. Jason caught her just before she hit the ground. The spoon clattered to the floor. The girls watched in stunned silence. He took her to the hospital immediately, heart racing, arms tight around her even as she protested weakly. The waiting room was cold and too white, and Jason sat there with all 3 girls clinging to him, their small bodies curled into his sides. He didn't know what to say, only that he couldn't lose her, not again, not like this. The hours stretched endlessly until a doctor finally emerged, explaining that it was exhaustion, severe dehydration, and stress, but thankfully, nothing more serious. She would recover with rest. Jason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That night, after Amber was settled at home with a mountain of pillows and a prescription for rest, Jason tucked the girls into their beds and returned to her room. She looked at him from her pillow, her voice hoarse. "I'm sorry. I didn't want you to worry." He sat beside her and took her hand gently in his. "You don't have to carry everything alone anymore," he said. "I'm here. We're in this together now." She looked at him like she wanted to believe it, like she had been holding her world together with threads and was finally considering letting someone help her sew it stronger. In the days that followed, Jason took on more than he ever imagined he could. He balanced business calls with story time, ran board meetings over video while packing school lunches, and answered emails while waiting in the school pickup line. And somehow, it worked. He didn't feel like he was losing control, he felt like he was becoming someone better. Late one evening, Amber watched him from the doorway as he braided Sophie's hair and helped Haley tape stars to her science project. She whispered more to herself than to him, "I never imagined this for us. I thought I'd always do it alone." Jason turned, not with a speech but with a quiet promise in his eyes. "You're not alone anymore." That night, she leaned against him on the couch while the girls slept, her head on his shoulder, her breath finally steady. And for the first time in years, the silence between them wasn't filled with questions. It was filled with peace. Spring crept in slowly that year, like it was afraid to make promises too soon. The mornings were still cold, but flowers began to bloom along the sidewalks, and the light that filtered through the apartment windows in the late afternoon had turned warmer, softer. Jason had begun arriving earlier and staying later. He didn't just pick the girls up from school, he stayed through dinner, bath time, and often long after bedtime stories had been whispered and lights had been dimmed. Amber stopped waiting for him to leave. He became part of the evening in a way that felt natural, like he had always belonged there. One Thursday evening, as Jason sat on the couch helping Haley cut paper stars for her school project, Sophie appeared in the hallway holding a drawing behind her back. "Close your eyes," she said, bouncing on her feet. Jason played along, and when he opened them, she handed him the picture. It was a crayon portrait of 4 stick figures standing in front of a house, each one labeled, Mom, me, Sophie, Emma, and finally, Dad. The word caught in his throat. He looked at Amber, who stood by the kitchen counter pretending to wipe it down even though it was already clean. She didn't say anything, but she didn't look away either. Jason looked back at Sophie and asked, "You drew this?" She nodded. "That's our family." He pulled her into his arms and held her for longer than she expected. Her small arms wrapped around his neck without hesitation. It wasn't long after that when the girls began asking if he would ever move in. They asked it with the innocence of children who hadn't yet learned that adults hesitate with their hearts. Amber heard them, of course. She didn't answer for him, and he didn't answer either. Not yet. Instead, he started doing the little things that made it obvious he already had one foot planted in the home. He bought a second toothbrush. He started keeping a change of clothes in Amber's closet. He took over Sunday breakfasts. He found himself falling into routines that didn't feel temporary. One afternoon, Amber invited him to a parent-teacher conference. It was Emma's. Jason had offered to watch the girls so Amber could go alone, but she surprised him by asking, "Would you come with me?" The teacher greeted them with a kind smile and began talking about Emma's growth, how she become more vocal, more confident, how she had drawn a picture of her dad and talked about him with pride. Jason felt the words settle heavily in his chest. Afterward, Amber and he walked back in silence. When they reached the apartment, she turned to him and said, "I didn't expect this." He asked what she meant. "You. Them. Us. I didn't think I'd ever feel this again. Safe." Jason took her hand in his. "Neither did I." They didn't speak about the future out loud, not yet, but the air between them had changed. It wasn't filled with uncertainty anymore, it was filled with possibility. Jason had found himself learning things he never knew he needed to know, like how to braid hair without pulling too hard, how to tell when a story was more important than being on time, how to carry the weight of another person's exhaustion and still smile through it. One evening, Emma asked him where he lived. When he answered truthfully, she looked confused. "But you're here more than there." He didn't have a response. Amber walked into the room just in time to hear and offered a quiet solution. "Maybe one day, he'll live here too." Emma smiled. "That would be perfect." Later that night, Jason found himself staring out the window after the girls were asleep. Amber joined him, wrapping herself in a blanket and leaning into his side. "You've become their home," she said. "And mine too, in a way I forgot was possible." He didn't answer right away. He simply pulled her closer and kissed the top of her head. Spring had officially arrived. And with it, something else had bloomed, something tender and strong, like the roots of a life that had taken hold in soil that had once been cracked from too many storms. They hadn't planned any of it. But somehow, it was everything they didn't know they needed. The day Jason officially moved in was quiet, almost anticlimactic. There was no grand announcement, no boxes stacked high in the hallway, no speeches about changes or new beginnings. Instead, it happened on a Saturday morning when the girls woke up to find his coffee mug sitting next to Amber's on the kitchen counter and his shoes neatly placed by the door next to theirs. Sophie noticed first and whispered something to Haley, who squealed and ran to find Emma. Moments later, all three of them were piling into Jason's lap as he sat on the couch tying his shoelaces. "You live here now?" Sophie asked, her eyes wide. Jason looked at Amber, who was leaning against the kitchen doorway, watching with a smile she didn't try to hide anymore. He looked back at them and said, "If that's okay with you." They didn't answer with words, only hugs and the kind of laughter that fills every corner of a home. In the weeks that followed, the house changed in small but significant ways. Jason took over the Sunday grocery runs, making sure to buy all the right snacks even when he had to text Amber 3 times from the store to confirm which cereal Emma liked and which one Sophie thought was too crunchy. He helped with school drop-offs and began to know the names of the other parents. The teachers waved to him. The girls called him for help with science fair projects, for advice on how to fix broken shoelaces, and to read just one more story before bed. He never said no. Not once. Amber returned to a day schedule and finally started sleeping full nights again. With Jason there, the evenings weren't just easier, they were lighter. They cooked dinner together, fell into routines that felt like rituals, and laughed more than either of them ever had in their separate lives. Every once in a while, Amber would catch Jason staring at the girls when they weren't looking, his expression filled with wonder, like he still couldn't believe they were his. Sometimes she caught herself doing the same. One afternoon, Emma brought home a permission slip for a school event. There was a small section labeled "Emergency Contact," and beneath that, another line that asked for parent/guardian name. Without hesitating, she wrote Jason Carter in neat, careful letters. When Amber saw it later that evening, she didn't say anything. She just smiled, folded the paper, and tucked it into her purse. A month later, the girls' school hosted a spring concert. They had been rehearsing for weeks, whispering about their song choices, designing matching headbands with glitter and ribbons. Jason sat in the front row beside Amber, holding her hand tightly while the girls climbed onto the small stage in their coordinated outfits. When the music started, they didn't sing right away. Instead, Sophie stepped up to the microphone and said, "We want to dedicate this song to someone really special. He's new in our family, but he already makes it feel like the best one in the world." Then they sang. It wasn't perfectly in tune, and they forgot some of the words, but it was perfect. After the show, as they all walked home together under a soft pink sky, Amber leaned her head against Jason's shoulder and whispered, "I'm glad you stopped for coffee that day." He kissed her forehead and said, "So am I." At home, they tucked the girls into bed, each one asking if he would still be there in the morning. He answered the same way he always did now, without hesitation. Always. Later that night, Amber sat with him on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, a quiet smile on her face. "Do you regret anything?" she asked. Jason looked at her for a long time before answering. "Only the time I lost. But not this. Not now." She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. The house was silent except for the occasional sound of the girls turning in their beds. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined. It was better. Because it was real, earned, and built out of love that had survived distance, fear, and the unexpected. In the soft hum of their shared silence, surrounded by the warmth of a family they never planned for, they understood something neither had dared hope for: this wasn't a second chance. It was the only chance that had ever mattered. I believe the ending of this story is the kind that lingers in your heart long after the last words are read. It's not about a perfect resolution or a fairy tale finale, it's about healing, redemption, and the quiet power of showing up when it matters most. Jason didn't just find his daughters, he found a version of himself he never thought existed. Amber didn't just forgive, she allowed love to return in a way that felt earned. And the girls, who started the story with a shared muffin and invisible candles, ended it surrounded by a family that finally felt whole. That kind of ending isn't just happy, it's deserved. And that makes it beautiful.